Ladies and gentlemen, dear members and colleagues, on behalf of the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition, I wish you a good morning. My name is Sven Rösner and I will present today's webinar. I hope that you and your families are well. Thank you very much for having registered and tuned in today for this session, during which we shall take a look at the European Renovation Wave and long-term renovation strategies. As we saw during our efficiency conference last year and during our work on several publications since, building energy efficiency is a cornerstone in the strive for CO2 neutrality, as energy consumption for heat and cold account for roughly half of the total primary energy consumption in both countries. While over 75% of Europe's residential building stock is energy inefficient today, 85 to 95% of it will still be used in 2050. With a current average renovation rate of about 1% a year across Europe, progress is still slow compared to the potential and the need to drive down the energy consumption. Building energy efficiency is also an effective creator of jobs and decentralized added value. So it is no surprise that it also plays an important role in France's and Germany's respective COVID-19 relief programs. These are some of the reasons why we would like to take the opportunity today to compare the French and German approaches towards energy efficiency, and we are very glad to have two experts with us today that will analyze and compare both concepts for us. Sibyl Stoiver and Hélène Sibillot, you are respectively head of the Berlin office and senior policy advisor at the European Building Performance Institute. Good morning to you. We are very much looking forward to hear what do you have to say in a minute. Before I'll pass over to you, I have a few technical announcements to make. We are aware of the fact that this issue has many aspects and that you, our audience, might have quite a few questions for our speakers. You can submit them via the questions function in the webinar cockpit. We will do our best to keep at least 20 minutes for a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but that might not be enough to answer all of them. I'd like to apologize for this eventuality straight away. However, we shall brief our speakers on all unanswered questions after the end of the webinar. Also, the slides of the presentation will soon be available on our website for you to download. A big thank you to our speakers for agreeing to this. You shall receive a notification mail once they are available for you, and a video recording of the session will also soon be up on the website in the member section for you to download. If you should experience difficulties with the sound or the image, my advice for you would be to shut down the webinar plugin and to relaunch it by clicking the link in the notification mail you received this morning. One last thing before we start. At the end of the webinar, you will be asked to participate in a quick questionnaire, which consists of just 5 questions. You can skip that, of course, but if you participate, you will help us to improve our format. And that's all from my side for now. Let's get started. Sibyl and Hélène, please take over. Have a great webinar, everyone.
Yes, good morning, everybody, and thanks a lot, Sven Rösner, for that kind introduction. And thanks a lot to the whole team of the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition for organizing this webinar on this important topic of the long-term renovation strategies in Europe. My colleague Hélène and I are going to navigate you through a couple of studies that we carried out in the past months, analyzing the long-term renovation strategies across Europe and deep diving into the results for France and Germany. Before we start doing so, I will briefly introduce you to BPIE, our work, and provide you with some background figures on the European policy framework, the Renovation Wave, and also some key figures on the French and German building stock to summarize then the main challenges for both countries. Next slide, please. So BPIE's mission is basically to improve the European energy performance of the buildings and to increase climate protection in the building stock by providing analysis, research pieces, by aligning with stakeholders, engaging stakeholders, and by helping to develop pragmatic and implementable policy ideas and approaches. Sven Rösner said before, Elaine is a senior policy advisor and mainly works on projects related to European policy making. And I am mainly responsible for all Germany-related programs and projects that we carry out from our Berlin office. Next slide, please. And the next slide, so we start with the European framework. Next slide, please. So the ambition level for our building stock is, of course, linked to the overarching policy framework in the EU, and both the Paris Agreement and the European Green Deal prescribe that the European Union shall be climate neutral by 2050. And as you're probably aware, we're currently in the negotiations and probably having a new climate protection target for 2030 of at least minus 55% compared to 1990. And if we translated this to the previous effort sharing approach, this would then mean that in 2030, the French building sector would only be allowed to emit 38 million tons of CO2, and the German building sector would only be allowed to emit 53 million tons of CO2 emissions. So that's quite an ambition level. The European Buildings Performance Directive, the EPBD, amended most recently in 2018, is the legislative tool to implement the targets in the building sector. And with the 2018 version, it also sets the target to have by 2050 a decarbonized building stock, but not only decarbonized, but also highly efficient building stock. And one of the main tools to make sure that member states reach that target is the long-term renovation strategies, which member states have to submit to the European Commission according to Article 2A of the Directive. Next slide, please. An important strategic communication document has been launched in October last year to implement the European Green Deal in the building sector. It's the Renovation Wave, which came with a couple of other documents, and most importantly, an action plan, which provides a clear timeline of what will happen in the future. Its main overarching target is to doubling the renovation rate from 1% to at least 2%. Next slide, please. And it provides proposes quite some actions and interventions in different areas, both in strengthening information but also providing legal certainty and setting up new regulation. But an important part of the Renovation Wave is to ensure adequate and well-targeted funding, which then goes hand in hand with capacity building and technical assistance in the member states. It touches upon the smart buildings, but has also the objective of proposes measures to decarbonize heating and cooling. An important section of the Renovation Wave touches upon socio-economic objectives, such as combating fuel poverty and making sure that the measures and the costs coming along with them are fairly distributed. And then the Renovation Wave proposes to phase in also sustainability into the construction sector. The whole idea about whole life carbon, life cycle assessment of the construction sector and circularity is meant with this aspect. And last but not least, the European Bauhaus initiative is really about making sure that with covering all the objectives aesthetics and well living in that houses will be covered and will be not forgotten. Next slide, please. And this is the timeline of the renovation wave. And one really important thing that happens in this year, as you see for 2021, is the revision and the proposals for a revised energy efficiency directive and a revised energy performance of buildings directive. The sustainability aspects will then be phased in a bit later. 2023, 2024 is foreseen in that timeline. Next slide, please. And this is really to highlight again the most important aspects from our viewpoint when it comes to the revision of the directives. The energy efficiency directive, the proposal is awaited already in the first half of this year. And the most important proposition is to extend, or will probably be the extension of the requirements for renovation of buildings to all public administration levels, not limiting it to the central government buildings only. And the revision of the EPBD is, we're in the middle of the consultation process, and we expect the proposal of the Commission to be published by the end of this year, and including proposals to revise the energy performance certificate scheme and to introduce mandatory minimum energy performance standards for the existing building stock. And then another point that might be of importance is to consider the introduction and the definition of what a deep renovation standard would imply. Next slide, please. Coming to the long-term renovation strategies, member states have to take up a number of prescribed aspects in their long-term renovation strategies, and the whole instrument has been considerably strengthened with its move from the EED to the EPBD with this latest amendments in 2018. And it touches upon many aspects. I'm not going through all of them. Elaine will talk more about it. But among others, member states have to report and set up a milestone and indicator system with objectives for 2030 and 2040 and 2050. They have to show how investments in energy renovation will be mobilized, and they have to give an estimation about wider benefits of energy renovation. Next slide, please. And it's important to understand that the long-term renovation strategies are not only meant to guide national implementation of policies and measures that are compatible with long-term targets, but they are also perceived at the European level as a main tool to understand policy making in member states. So in the Renovation Wave, the Commission recommends member states that they take the long-term renovation strategy as a guiding document for the resilience and recovery plans. And they clearly state that the assessment of the long-term renovation strategies, the identification of gaps and good practices will help and justify new actions when proposing new regulations within the review of the 3 directives, EED, EPBD, and Renewable Energy Directive. Next slide, please. So where are we standing now? What is the challenge in France and Germany? What needs to be addressed? I will provide you with a couple of numbers and figures. Next slide, please. Yes. So this is the European building stock in terms of distribution of EPC classes. And if in 2050 all buildings were to have an EPC class of at least B or better, then we can easily see that at least 90% of the current stock will have to be improved. Next slide, please. So 50% of the buildings that have been built before 1975, so really the old buildings, will still be in use in 2050. And this is just a very easy calculation that renovation is the main challenge to decarbonize and have a highly efficient building stock by 2050. Next slide, please. This slide shows the evolution of greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector comparing France and Germany. And you see here in absolute numbers that the emissions are higher in Germany because also building stock is bigger. So there are more buildings and more floor space in Germany. But you see that it's going to be a challenge for both countries to reach the current emission targets. And if you click to the next slide, you can see that if we were to increase the building sector target in line with the -55 overall greenhouse gas emission reduction target that is currently under negotiation, this would mean a really steeper decrease of emissions until 2030. So for Germany, I know for sure that there's already a gap to reach the current targets for 2030. So additional measures will have to be taken, and they will have to be stepped up again if there will be a new target. Next slide, please. This slide shows you, when looking at the floor space of residential and non-residential buildings across Europe, that France and Germany have to be front runners both to decarbonize the building stocks, because if taken together, they are accounting for 1/3 almost of the whole floor space in Europe if UK is excluded. Next slide, please. And this slide shows you the rings. It shows you, first of all, that there are a lot more single-family houses in Europe, and compared to the 20 million multi-family houses in Europe, but both of them are pretty old. 2/3 has been built before 1980. And if you click to the next slide, you see that when it comes to the distribution of population by dwelling type, that in France, most people live in single-family buildings. So this is the huge challenge in France to get renovation done here, and in Germany more than half of the population lives in multi-family buildings. So that's kind of a bit different, the challenge here. Next slide, please. In terms of energy consumption, if the energy performance was the main topic, you see here that heating is certainly the big driver, and the energy performance is a little better in Germany here compared to France, but still both need to considerably come down with the energy consumption in kilowatt hours per square meter in year. Next slide, please. And looking at the energy mix for the residential sector, it becomes clear that there is a difference in France and Germany, with much more electric heating in France compared to Germany. But when we look into the non-residential sector on the next slide, we see that the energy mix rather compares across Europe. And one final figure, I believe, for the one on the building stocks in Europe, next slide, please, shows that if we take the overall patterns for both non-residential and residential building stock in France and Germany, you could see that despite the differences in electric heating, district heating, you still see that they compare a lot more than compared to other countries in the EU. So to conclude here and come to the next slide, please. Both countries need to considerably reduce their energy consumption in buildings to achieve the 2030 greenhouse gas emission targets. And while there are differences, there's still similar challenges. So there's a lot of opportunity to learn from each other. And next slide. And now we'll turn to our analysis of the long-term renovation strategies, which will reveal how do the countries really compare policy-wise. And I will hand over to my colleague Hélène Sibilo, who will present our main analysis on the long-term renovation strategies.
Thank you, Sibyl, for this presentation, giving the overview of the EU policy landscape and also recalling the, let's say, the picture for both France and Germany on their building stock. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as Sibyl said, I will present you in more detail the results of our analysis of the long-term renovation strategies, basing this presentation mainly on 2 reports which were issued in the last month. So the first one, which you see the cover on the left, is a review of EU member states 2020 long-term renovation strategies, which was published in September 2020 and is a compliance analysis. So in this study, we looked at to what extent long-term renovation strategies complied legally with the text of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. The second study, which I will present, and you see the cover on the right, is called The Road to Climate Neutrality, Our National Long-Term Renovation Strategies Fit for 2050, and we issued it just 2 weeks ago. And here we looked at do long-term renovation strategies actually are they fit for purpose in terms of the ambition for decarbonizing the building stock. The good news is both France and Germany are included in these analyses, so it's a perfect background for this presentation. Next slide. So starting with the compliance analysis, this first study that we did back in the end of 2020 looked at 14 renovation strategies. Why 14? Just because those were the available national strategies at the time. And the objective, as I said, was to check the compliance of national strategies with legal requirements of the directive. As a disclaimer, this evaluation is judging the completeness of the strategy and the quality of the details provided, but it doesn't look at whether the policies and the measures that are included in the strategy are ambitious, credible, or implemented. So it is really a compliance legal analysis of the strategy on paper. And how did we do that? We attributed for each clause of the renovation strategy, or if you want, subparagraph of the Article 2A of the directive, we attributed a score ranging from 0, meaning it was not addressed, to 5 being exemplary. And we said that 3 meant that it was compliant or acceptable. The overall result is that actually out of the 14 renovation strategies analyzed, only 1 was deemed compliant overall, and it was Spain. Next slide, please. So if we look at the details of the different requirements of the renovation that the renovation strategies have to comply with, out of the 14 renovation strategies, there was some similarities, and we saw that member states encountered the same difficulties. And these difficulties were, for example, how to assess multiple benefits of renovation. There was a lack generally of information on implementation of past renovation strategies. So we know that there were already 2 iterations before this one in 2014 and in 2017, and there was not really an information how these strategies were implemented. Also, there was a lack of information on how these strategies were elaborated with the public and in consultation with stakeholders. Some segments like public buildings were not so explicitly covered. And also the most important point maybe was that measures and milestones in 2030 and 2040 were also missing in a lot of strategies. What was a bit better was the presentation of how trigger points in the life cycle of buildings were used to trigger renovation. What is also done quite well on average was giving the overview of the national building stock, reporting on expected energy savings, and there is a reasonable detail on existing or proposed renovation policies, although these policies are rather on renovation but not deep renovation. Next slide. So now the question is, how are France and Germany doing? Here you have a table which is summarizing all the clauses of the Article 2A requirements and the score of both France and Germany. And on the last column, you see the EU average. When I say EU average, of course, it's the 14 strategies that were available and analyzed. You see that for France and Germany, we have a lot of either incomplete or adequate. Next slide, please. But here I transformed the table to make this comparative analysis a bit more interesting. And here you see actually the color coding change, meaning that when you have a green box, it means that either France or Germany is doing better than the EU average. Red, of course, is doing worse than average, and orange means that it's approximately around the average. So we can clearly see here that there are some areas where either France or Germany are doing either better or worse, which could inform us of where there could be some areas of improvement, or on the other side, where France and Germany could actually be the good example for other member states in the EU. Next slide, please. So the main messages from this analysis is that actually France and Germany score approximately equally and around the average on their 2020 renovation strategy. If we compare to our previous analysis, so the first renovation strategies in 2014, we had better scores, so 3.2 for France and 2.8 for Germany. But as a disclaimer, at that time, there were less requirements to fulfill to have a renovation strategy. As I said, this is an opportunity to identify areas of improvement based on where France and Germany are doing better or worse than average. But again, a disclaimer, we are aware that this might not fully reflect the reality, because our analysis is solely based on what member states reported officially to the Commission in 2020, so a year ago when they submitted their renovation strategies. So we know that some areas since then might have improved because of political discussions, and we also know that some areas might be actually well described in the renovation strategy, but they're still not implemented, or they're not working so well in practice. Next slide. So coming to the areas where we could learn from each other. What we could learn from France based on our analysis and the good scores, we know that the French renovation strategy is giving a quite good overview of its building stocks. It is quite extensive in its description on policies for public buildings. It has a roadmap with progress indicators and a milestone for 2040. And it also, in an annex, gave a good report on the consultation done with stakeholders. What we could learn from Germany is actually policies to stimulate the cost-effective deep renovation. And this is interesting because we know that other member states are maybe less good on policies for deep renovation. Another good area which can come from Germany is actually smart technologies, communities or neighborhood approaches, skills and education. What expertise both France and Germany could bring to other member states are also the use of trigger points and basing policies on trigger points to boost renovation. And then there are a few areas where a collective effort of all member states is needed, and this is targeting worst performing buildings and solving the split incentive issue, alleviating energy poverty, calculating and monetizing wider benefits, and then of course, as I said, giving more information on how past renovation strategies were implemented and their results. Next slide. So now I come to the second analysis, which is looking at the ambition of the renovation strategies in terms of decarbonization and achieving a highly energy efficient building stock. So here we again restricted the analysis to 8 renovation strategies. And here the selection was based on the fact that these 8 member states are representing 50% of the EU population. They span a range of geographies and country sizes. So yeah, as a disclaimer, this is a selection of member states, but we find that with these criteria in mind, this is quite representative. And our objective was really to look at a specific part of the Article 2A of the directive, which is that member states shall set out a roadmap with measures and domestically established measurable progress indicators with a view to the long-term 2050 goal of reducing GHG emissions by 80 to 95% compared to 1990. in order to ensure a highly energy efficient and decarbonized national building stock. Next slide. So the overall results is that out of these 8 member states analyzed, only 4 include an objective that is at or above 90% GHG emissions reduction, so compliant with the legal text of the EPBD. But actually none of them target a full decarbonization, although Spain is also again quite good here with a 98.8% objective. But that is of course understandable because the legal text of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive came out before the climate neutrality goal was established. So even full compliance with the legal text is not enough to bring us to climate neutrality. What is more worrying is actually that most strategies fail to provide sufficient detail over the period up to 2050 regarding their supporting policies and the financial support to increase renovation and decarbonize the building stock. And also that most of the strategies analyzed put more effort into decarbonizing energy supply systems rather than improving the energy performance of the building stock. We see that expected reduction of energy use are spanning from 20 to 70%. And if this is too low, if we don't put enough emphasis on reducing the energy consumption, we know that we are losing the multiple benefits of energy renovation of buildings. Next slide. So for France and Germany, what we can say also from the start is that there are different base year used, but that doesn't prevent us to make a comparison. We know that for France, we have an objective to 2050, which is a reduction of 94% in CO2 emissions and a 41% reduction of energy use by 2050. So our conclusions was that the decarbonized part is quite good, but that there's insufficient effort directed to improving the energy performance of the stock. And for Germany, at least in the official text of the renovation strategies, there is no clear 2050 decarbonization objective or an indication of the target for reduction of energy use. Next slide. When it comes to supporting policies, I don't want to make a full list or explain every measure in detail. What we can highlight from the 2 renovation strategies here is that for the French one, energy renovation of buildings is said to be a national priority with a focus on housing renovation, so residential segment, and fighting against fuel poverty. What is interesting maybe to highlight in the French one is the measures targeting tertiary buildings, so a specific segment of the stock with a special decree outlining a series of energy savings targets over the next 30 years. When it comes to Germany, what is included in the 2030 Climate Action Program, there is a lot of measures here, but mostly we can talk about the carbon price for heating fuels, tax support, boosted energy, existing programs for energy renovation, a new support program for industrial renovation, an expected review of standards by 2023, an improvement of energy advice for households, and that is the building renovation passports, and federal buildings highlighted as having to lead by example. Next. When it comes to the financial dimensions, and this is interesting to see how actually France and Germany both outline a number of financial schemes that exist or that should be improved or created, but that's mostly, as for other member states, the description is rather short to medium term, and there is not really an indication as to the total investment required to renovate the building stock up to 2050, and also not how it will be financed. So also, for example, there is no indication on how the public programs, for example, would trigger the necessary funding on the private side. Maybe what is interesting from France is that here you have some schemes which are addressing various sectors. So for example, you have specific funding for social housing, for public sector, for training, and this is mentioned in the renovation strategy. Next. So just to finish on a few recommendations that we made for both the European Commission and Member States following our two analyses. For Member States, of course, we would say that the long-term renovation strategies should target a full decarbonization of the building stock, and they should also put more emphasis on reducing the energy consumption. The long-term renovation strategies therefore should be aligned with climate neutrality by 2050. And if possible, the member states should update those strategies before 2024, which is the legal, let's say, next step to update the national energy and climate plans, which include the long-term renovation strategy. And then looking at the European Commission, our recommendations would be that the Commission should assess the renovation strategies, not only looking at the legal text of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, but also in view of course, the 2050 climate neutrality objective. And we know that the Commission actually is looking at that and will very soon, before the end of this month, also issue its own analysis of available long-term renovation strategies. Our two other calls to the Commission is to adjust the ambition of the Renovation Wave strategy up to 3% deep renovation annual rate by 2030, and to amend in the upcoming revision at the end of this year to undertake actually a comprehensive revision of the EPBD and to align it with our new objectives of climate neutrality by 2050 and an increased climate target by 2030. And with that, I pass over the floor back to Sibylle, who is then also going to give you a few information on how renovation strategies are implemented at local level.
Yes, thanks, Ellen. So there is one more study that we carried out that looked into the long-term renovation strategies, or at 9 in total, I think, that were available at that time, but more to look into what is in the long-term renovation strategies on policies and measures for the local level. It has been funded by the German Environmental Ministry's OFATE program. What we can generally show that the local level could certainly be strengthened in the member states' long-term renovation strategies. Of course, it's not the focus of the long-term renovation strategies, but we still consider it useful. Knowing that positive energy districts and project aggregation will be key to accelerate the renovation rate, we think that long-term municipal planning will be key in the future, and this could be carved out a little more also in the long-term renovation strategies. And comparing the different countries, we see that besides Spain, especially France, included a lot of good practice examples for the local level, including the SPL Rosier, Réseau Canopé, Logement Social, SEM Positif, P2C. So it's a rather rich report, and including a lot of good practice examples, also explaining why we think it's a good practice example. And I would highly recommend you to have a look at it and deep dive into some of the examples. Next slide, please. This is just one snapshot from our analysis showing that while financing instruments and provisions for public buildings are often directly, explicitly tailored to the local level and reported on in the long-term renovation strategies, aspects like data collection, tailored approaches, and integrated planning is only in few long-term renovation strategies highlighted. Next slide, please. So we came up with a couple of policy recommendations to the studies. It's basically suggesting to link instruments better, to make use of synergies, to make sure whenever financing is provided, that data collection at the local level takes place, to make sure that multiple benefits are untapped, and that the cooperation between municipalities should considerably be strengthened, and there are some good practices on how cooperation could be organized in the study. So we come to our concluding slides. The next slide, please. So the EPBD revision is taking place. I've said earlier that the consultation process has started, and we expect the proposal to be there by the end of the year. And the main topics are set. So it's about a proposition of mandatory energy performance standards. It's about the revision of the EPC schemes. And also, it now seems that it could be that new regulation for new buildings, or that the regulation for new buildings could be updated as well. And our last slide that we have is dedicated to the question of how well prepared are both countries to those aspects when looking at those aspects. And before I conclude some sentences on Germany, I would quickly pass on to Hélène, because she's French and knows much better about France. So Hélène, please, would you cover the French aspects?
Sure. I can give a couple of sentences on what France is doing at the moment on these hot topics. So on minimum energy performance standards, there are ongoing parliamentary discussions to make operational a phase out of rented buildings labeled F or G in the EPC class by 2028. Regarding energy performance certificates, there is an ongoing reform on the calculation methods for certificate to have not only the energy performance but also CO2 emissions displayed. That should come actually in place for the summer this year. On the 2040-2050 targets and new buildings, we know that the French strategy has a 2050 objective and the 2030 milestone, but not a 2041, so that could be improved. There are also ongoing discussions on a possible gas phase out from new buildings with a new environmental regulation for new buildings as of the 1st of January 2022. And we were talking at the start about the importance of renovation strategies for the recovery plans. And we know that the French recovery plans has put some I think 7 billion euro on building renovation, and there is also a part of it which goes into how to industrialize energy renovation with the focus on social housing. So France is quite active at the moment on these different topics. And now I pass back the floor to Sibylle for Germany.
Yeah, thanks, Hélène. So with regard to the mandatory energy performance standards, we observe a slowly starting debate in Germany. I think stakeholders and policymakers are beginning to understand what this policy instrument could be and could do, and what an enabling framework would consist of, and what different design options are available. So this is a starting debate. For the EPC scheme, there is a big need for a revision. The Commission sees the EPCs as one of the main tools to show commitment and compatibility with targets. So they see them as a means of verification for funding, show compliance with mandatory energy performance standards, etc. And therefore, it would need to be a unique system that would come up with comparable results to be a fair scheme. So there would need to be some work done and some updates to be introduced in Germany. I'm very much looking forward to the new support scheme, which is hopefully being adopted by the end of this month in Germany to incentivize new production capacity for prefabricated building elements, facades and others. So in line with this, the idea of project aggregation and industrialization of energy renovation on top of supporting the projects to set up or to show that this is possible and to scale those projects up. This policy would also incentivize the new production capacity, which is, I think, very interesting. And for the 2040 and 2050 targets, and as you've heard already earlier, when Hélène explained that they have not been displayed in the long-term renovation strategies, and the climate protection law in Germany only had the binding targets until 2030 fixed. So there is still some kind of a clarity of what would be the objectives to comply with the overall long-term objectives for climate protection in Germany. Having said this, I think there's a lot of material to learn from each other, and I am sure that also you as the participants have a lot of ideas of what to deepen and what aspects we could foster those learnings, and I'm very curious to looking forward to the Q&A session right now, and I give back the floor to Sven Rösner.
Yes, thank you very much, Sibyl and Helen, for your presentation, which gives us a lot to think about, as you said. I see that we have received quite a few questions already, but please do not hesitate to send us yours via the question function of the cockpit. So maybe to start, there was one curve you showed in the beginning where we saw the evolution in France and in Germany, and also the trajectory towards 2030. We saw, that's just a question to better understand what's going on in the German curve, that it was actually going up instead of going down for the last years, even though the winters have not been particularly harsh. Could you give us some input on that? Maybe we can skip back the slides. I think
I'm not sure. I think the very recent years are not in the graph. I think it stopped somewhere in.
The slide was quite at the beginning. I think I couldn't take down the number because there are no numbers on the slides. But maybe Celine, maybe you can go back some 15 slides or something. Was really in the introductory part. Yep. One ahead. Yes. No. One more. Yeah, that's it.
I think it was just 1 year, right? It was 2016. I cannot tell you about this particular year, I must say. And there's some years missing, because I think the last year that was that we took the data from was from 2016. So I'm afraid I can't.
Okay.
I don't remember what was the 2016.
No worries. Now you spoke about the concept of deep renovation, and well, that's obviously quite a substantial thing to do in a house. If we have 60% of energy efficiency, what would be for you the right mix? If you could advise a government, what would be for you the right mix between reaching out for low-hanging fruits and something like deep renovation? How much of which would you put in the policy?
I think it's one of these very difficult questions also that is being faced when talking about mandatory energy performance standards. And it's the question if this is a policy instrument to address the worst performing buildings, and if that should stop at some certain point, for example, when all buildings have reached the level D, and say, okay, the rest has to be incentivized by other policies and measures that needs to be done on top. And I think, and the others say that there are other people saying that we should design maps in a way that they are in the end compliant with the 2050 targets. I think what has to be ensured for the next years is that the worst performing buildings are phased out, and so maps are addressing those, but with measures that are in line with the 2050 targets, so that we do not create lock-in effects with the measures being taken, not to just have shallow renovation to increase the next, to reach the next level, but to have the next level, to envisage, to have the long-term target in mind. Sorry. That would be my first reaction. And the second reaction would be that I believe at a certain point in time, we have to look into districts and to see how to decarbonize, how the decarbonization of heating and cooling within a district could be organized so that like project aggregation within districts can be done on a scale that makes sense and is cost effective, but also to make sure that historical buildings that have a hard time to be tackled and reduced, that we make sure that still they are not forgotten. I think that's important, and I think it's important to accompany whatever standard you that you imply, that you support it, that you create financial support to make sure that those aspects that are not yet cost effective will be covered by financing support.
And if we talk about this and we compare Germany and France, but maybe also because you are a European institute, do you see one country that has developed a particularly effective way of triggering the right actions, maybe where policymakers could take a look at in order to reorganize support schemes in their countries?
Len, do you want, or I can also start? I think it's interesting that I think at the French level, I think there are at the regional level quite some initiatives to finance renovations, to look at social, like vulnerable income groups, and to also to capacity building for public authorities. I think that are worth to look at and to be copied and transferred to other jurisdictions. I think the German KfW scheme, the support schemes were former KfW, now it's all been changed, but the schemes are still existing and they are very successful, so that many people are taking into account or accessing the money, and they combine it with deep renovation. So I think that's really an important part. But I think the French way of putting up a MAP scheme in place already is a very interesting development, which we should monitor and understand how it works and what works well and what does not yet, maybe. So I think it's all these new policy instruments are ongoing and work in progress, and we have to monitor them closely to understand which elements work. And I think that's where we need an exchange and transparency also.
Yeah, maybe that was also
maybe
one question. Excuse me, Helen. Yes, please.
Yeah, maybe if I can just add on this, I would totally agree with Sibyl. Just to say that I think what we need to have an effective way is actually, we need regulation, we need financial support, we need advice and assistance, we need everything. What it seems maybe it would be a bit maybe a stereotypical way of presenting it, but it seems Germany is quite good on linking, as Sibyl said, the financial support to the energy performance with very strong KfW, which gives financial support and some assistance. It also has a good history and experience with building renovation passports, whereas in France, the renovation passport is maybe not so pushed by the government. There are some private initiatives with the P2E, for example, but not really a government program. Maybe in France, what we have more at the moment is more mandatory requirements with the tertiary decree for tertiary buildings to achieve a certain energy reduction by certain milestones. and now the worst performing buildings from the rental sector being possibly phased out by 2028. But what is missing maybe is more assistance and more financial support, which would be linked to the energy performance to achieve, while we have maybe in France a focus of financial support being linked to the income of the households being funded. So there are different approaches, and I wouldn't say that one is maybe better than the other, but certainly I would look into actually matching the two, having good mandatory requirements, but also then supplemented with good financial support and good advice. So both countries have actually something to put on the table, I think, in this regard.
Yeah, we had quite a few questions about the low-income households you just mentioned, and I also know from my colleagues in Berlin that this is a big issue, that sometimes renovation is used as an argument for a rise in leases. What could be done to overcome a dilemma where energy efficiency becomes some kind of pretext to increase leases, for example, because that would obviously decrease the acceptability of energy efficiency works in both countries?
I think one thing is to distribute the costs and to say to define the share of who's taking over the cost for it. But I think in the course of having new monetary standards established for existing buildings, I think I think one could consider even the obligation to take on fundings and to take up the available fundings to finance the renovation could also be considered, because sometimes big housing companies do not necessarily have the urge to take the existing fundings to fund the renovation activity. So if funding is available and if it's basically up to a level that is not yet cost effective, if externalities are not taken into account, then that could be a way.
Okay, maybe one. I'm looking at the time, which is running out quickly. On with topic as with such a large variety of aspects as this one, I think we will accord ourselves some minutes more than planned. You presented the Green Deal in the beginning of your presentation, and some were wondering if we talk about sustainability, that would also concern jobs. We see now that there are some COVID-19 rescue packages that really boost or aiming at a boost in energy efficiency. Will that be a sustainable? Will that have a sustainable effect on jobs, for example, and the creation of added value? And also, do you think that energy efficiency can, by this means, become a factor for the economy that can generate added value, decentralized, sustainably?
Yes, I mean, the construction sector is and the value chain is a local value chain, and by promoting energy renovation, you will boost the economy. I mean, I don't know, Elaine, if you want to say something more on a European level here. I think the European Green Deal definitely takes into account this target of increasing jobs, and this is certainly being addressed and was in mind when putting a lot of money for energy renovation in the recovery packages. But I think that when we talk about sustainability, or when I talked previously about the sustainability phase in the renovation wave, while the job effects have been touched also in the renovation wave, I was more talking about environmental sustainability still. But both aspects are covered in the renovation wave. And maybe Elaine, you want to add a couple of sentences here.
Yes, I can briefly give a bit more data on this. We know that from also a previous study, for each 1 million invested in building renovation, you create 18 jobs on average in the EU, which is actually one of, the biggest sector in terms of job creation. And this has also been demonstrated by the International Energy Agency, which has found approximately the same numbers, 12 to 18. And there are considerable differences across member states. You have member states like Croatia, for example, where each 1 million euro is creating more than 20 or 25 jobs. So there is indeed a job creation potential if energy renovation of buildings is prioritized in the recovery plans, and this is the case in a lot of countries already. But of course, that still needs to be now fully, negotiated and implemented and rolled out. So hopefully, the negotiations will be finalized so that plans can actually be implemented already, let's say, second half of this year, early 2022, to enable the sector to recover from the post-COVID-19 economic crisis.
Okay. One last question, and then we'll finish. I think you mentioned old buildings, maybe historic buildings, maybe also listed buildings. I think of a city as like Paris, with a huge building stock in that category. Is there anything at all that could be done? Does the long-term renovation strategy address this type of case, or is it just something maybe too particular to be addressed specifically?
I can maybe say a few words on this. We didn't have a specific look at this in these 2020 analysis, but I have done this analysis for previous renovation strategies in the 2017 versions. And I think at that time, there was approximately half of the member states which had at least a mention of historic buildings in specific either program or specific measures for that type of, for that segment of the building stock. So if you want, I can also then briefly look again at this and provide some information to the person who asked the question in writing.
Great. Okay. Right. Yeah, we are already past 11, so I propose that we finish. Thank you very much. We already reached the end of this webinar. And thank you ever so much, Sibylle and Helene, for your enlightening presentation and your replies to the questions of our listeners. Many thanks also to Jules from our team for setting up this webinar, and to Céline and Audrey for the technical support today. Before we sign off, just a few announcements for your agendas. Coming up next at the Franco-German Office, we have on May 5th a conference on new business models for ground-mounted PV. On May 25th, a conference on renewable heat, which has been mentioned indirectly during the Q&A session, and its role for the energy transition. On June 2nd and 3rd, we will look at electrical grids and the energy transition, integration, fees, and interconnections. And also, not yet on our website, but very soon, on June 22nd, we will hold a political matinee in cooperation with the Embassy of France in Germany, during which we shall debate on the concept of just transition and illustrate it with examples from building energy efficiency. You can register for all our conferences on our website, for the webinars obviously as well. Just quickly, I will give you the URLs. It's the French one is OFATE.eu and the French one is the German one is DFBEW, and you will find today's slides obviously very soon and many interesting publications for you to download. And please do make sure that you're on our mailing list to stay updated on our upcoming events. This is all from my side for now. Thank you very much for tuning in today and being with us. Please do stay safe. See you very soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.